Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 44, Taking Charge. Weiss Schnee. The halls of Schnee Manor were oddly quiet, as Weiss walked reluctantly towards her destination. With each step she took, the clacking of her heels bounced off the walls, serving only to accentuate the silence, and to give the mansion's halls an abandoned feel. There was no warmth to it, no love or care, just a hollowness that was still rather unnerving despite growing up in it. However, she would gladly take the early silence halls over where she was heading. The source of the silence, the reason no one dared make a sound, was her father. It was rare that he worked from home, but when he did, everyone knew that the slightest disturbance would lead to a firing. Every member of staff knew to stay out of sight, to go about their work silently unless they were spoken to directly, so it didn't surprise Weiss that Violet kept her head down as she passed instead of the usual friendly greeting she always gave. Arriving at the end of the hallway, she glanced over the banister into the entryway and saw that the door that led to her father's office was already open. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to the stairs and gently walked down them, careful not to allow her heels to make too much noise as they were positioned right above her father's domain. Despite taking her time, she reached the bottom rather quickly and turned to walk through the door, closing it behind her as she knew her father would be annoyed to find it was left open. She had no idea why her father had called her to his office, though she suspected it was likely something to do with her work at the company. It still annoyed her that she wasn't doing much, that her time was taken up by menial tasks. But after Yang's visit 2 days ago, some of the stress had lifted. Knowing that Yang wanted to delay their reveal to focus on Raven was actually helpful, as she no longer had to push herself. However, that didn't change that the work was boring and beneath her. Though she could hardly say that if her father asked her. He had placed her there. To voice her desire would be the same as questioning his order, and would not be received well. Unfortunately, the T-shaped hallway was shorter than the stairs, so Weiss didn't have much time to think of a clever way to work around the issue before arriving at the plain white door of her father's office. Stopping in front of it, she heard voices on the other side, and raised her shaking hand to knock. Normally there would be consequences for interrupting a meeting, but her father wouldn't have called her to wait outside. So taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and knocked, the voices stopping immediately. "Enter!" The cold voice of her father sent a chill down her spine, and she wasted no time in pushing the door open. Walking into the equally cold office, Weiss saw her father sat behind his desk. His chilling blue eyes locked onto hers, as her peer at her through templed finger, and she matched his gaze. She hated that she'd inherited those eyes, that no matter her temperament her eyes always held a hint of his ice, that hatred broiled even hotter knowing what the man had done to Winter in this very room, but nonetheless, she smiled. Standing in front of his desk was her brother, his hands locked behind his back and his back straight, and he looked at the ground. As she approached the desk, he sheepishly looked her way, but quickly returned his gaze to the floor. "Good afternoon, father," she said politely with a small bow of her head. "You called for—" His hand raised, and she stopped talking instantly. "Weiss, remind me what grade you received on the exam your business tutor gave you." "A+, father," Weiss replied, and saw Whitley turn his head slightly away from her. It immediately clicked what had happened. "You hear that, boy?" he said, his eyes finally leaving her own and locking onto Whitley's, who quickly looked up. "Both of your sisters managed to receive full marks. So would you care to explain why?" His words turned venomous as he held up a slip of paper. "You barely managed an A?" Whitley didn't reply straight away, and Weiss tried her best not to look at him. "I would think that being in my office every day to gain first-hand experience would be more than enough to achieve this grade. So did you not study to cement the rest?" Their father drawled as his eyes narrowed. "Well? Speak, boy." "I'm sorry, father," Whitley said, his voice quivering slightly despite his clear attempts to keep it even. "My hand was injured and the difficulty in writing led to me missing a few points." "You have another hand that you can use, do you not?" Shock interrupted, the annoying in his voice and lack of care about Whitley's injury making Weiss' blood start to boil. "You know I do not care for excuses. Now I ask you again, how did you barely manage this grade? Did you not study? Was I not a good enough teacher? Were the years I have spent on you wasted on an Edie?" "I'm sorry, father," Weiss interrupted, her body trembling. Normally, she wouldn't interrupt her father like that, but seeing her brother wince at every question had made it impossible to stand by and watch. Whitley's grade may be partially my fault. She worded her lie carefully, making sure not to remove all blame from her brother, otherwise her father would see right through her attempt. Slowly, the man's eyes shifted back to her, and his brow furrowed as skepticism and intrigue passed across his eyes. Explain! I knew the course was a hard one, so I offered Whitley some of my old work to reference, she said firmly, and held his stony gaze. However, I was in a rush to acclimate myself to my new position in the company at the time, and may have accidentally given him one of my practice notebooks that held a few errors. Shocked eyes bored into hers in search of the truth, and Weiss held firm, not even daring to hope he would believe her, as he would no doubt see through that too. After what felt like a minute, he dropped his gaze and returned to Whitley. Is this true? Did you use these reference notes your sister provided? Before answering, the boy turned to her, and she saw a hint of surprise in his eyes. Knowing she couldn't make any obvious sign to tell him it was okay, Weiss simply blinked and held her eyes closed for a second longer than necessary, hoping he would get the hint. Thankfully he did, and returned his gaze to their father to give a solitary nod. I see, the Schnee elder said, and pressed his fingers back together, though there seemed to be a happiness to his voice. Then we shall let this serve as a lesson on what happens when you rely on others. But you will be retaking the exam, and you will be receiving full marks. Do I make myself clear? Yes, father, her brother said with a firm nod of his head. Very well. Now leave us. Turning on his heel, Whitley gave her a small look, and Weiss gave him an imperceptible nod. She couldn't help but smile inwardly at their father's words about relying on others, and how he had no idea that the lesson had actually been the opposite of what he thought. She hoped that Whitley had seen it too, but whether he did or not, Weiss didn't know, as he quickly left the room and shut the door behind him. Should I be concerned that a menial position has caused such ineptitude already? Hair stood up on the back of her neck at her father's drawled words. Consequences for what she was doing were already inevitable, but the last thing she needed was him questioning her abilities, especially when the position was actually far less than she was capable of. So putting a practiced smile on her face, she looked up to face her father's heartless eyes. Of course not, father, she said calmly, trying to keep the venom out of her voice as her stomach churned from looking into his eyes. It was simply an adjustment period. Good, he scowled, pulling open his drawer and pulling a letter from it. Sit. The word was an order that Weiss knew not to refuse. With a small nod, she pulled the chair opposite his desk to the center and sat down quietly, her hands crossed on her lap. She watched her father read the letter for a minute, his eyebrows furrowing more and more as his eyes slid across the words. Finally, when he reached the bottom, he placed the letter on the table and slid it over to her. Would you care to explain this to me, daughter? Weiss couldn't help but be slightly nervous to pick up the slip of paper, as thoughts rushed through her head of what it could be. Had someone found out about her and Yang and reported to him? Had her snooping into old records triggered an alarm? Whatever it was, she couldn't hesitate much further as her father's watchful gaze turned suspicious. So after taking a deep breath, she reached out and took the letter. Relief instantly washed over her as she saw it was simply a business email from the Atlas headquarters, with the topic being the nerd chip. Of all the things that could have been in the letter, she couldn't be happier about it being that. This here say that you denied the transfer of a project to Atlas where it would receive more funding, but I don't recall ever agreeing to such a thing. I decided to seek funding elsewhere, father, Weiss replied, her voice taking on the tone she used solely for business. I felt moving the project to Atlas might jeopardize that and cost the company more. And what made you think that? Should we move this project to Atlas, we will undoubtedly secure funding from the Atlas military, but it is highly unlikely we will acquire funding from the RMRF. Due to our tenuous relationship with them and their policy of reduced funding for project undertaken outside of Vale, I believe that keeping the project here with Dr. Polidina as its lead was our best chance to secure funding from both. And what makes you think the Atlas military will fund a project from outside its walls? Because this directly benefits them, Weiss replied simply. When this chip is finished, it will undoubtedly be very beneficial to the militaries of each kingdom. As we are an Atlas-based company that is unable to request funding from the militaries of other kingdoms, I'm sure General Ironwood will see how important it will be to aid in this project to gain favorable prices in the future. And you are certain of that? Yes, father. The man leant back with a hum as his cold blue eyes surveyed her. In truth, she didn't care too much about the military funding. Sure, she wanted it to increase the odds of her project being a success, but her main goal had always been the Remnant Medical Research Foundation. Atlas funding did nothing but make sure the chip was made. It helped no one but the military that way. But funding from the RMRF made sure that she could get it to the public for reasonable rates, and that was what she really wanted. So as she watched the thought behind her father's eyes, Weiss hoped that her reasoning had been sound, but they quickly darkened, and she knew that the battle would not be that easy. Very well, he said with an edge to his voice that made her nervous. We shall see about that. While she thought on what he could mean, Jacques stood up and walked over to a painting of Atlas. While it was undoubtedly a magnificent done art piece, something about it felt lifeless. She didn't know if it was just Atlas in general or the fact that the painter had no vision, but she found it plain and boring. I hear that General Ironwood will be visiting Beacon in 2 weeks, he said, his voice just as bland as the painting her was staring at. I will be holding a gala at the museum, and he will be in attendance. You will secure a promise of funding there. What? You said that the funding would be easy to acquire, so prove it, he said with a noticeable uptick in his voice. It was clear he wanted her to fail, that the order was just for his amusement. Should you succeed, the project will remain here, and you will be in charge of it. Should you fail, it will be transferred to Atlas. This is a test. She didn't need to question it, only to confirm it. Of course, he replied with a wave of his hand. You are the heiress, and I need to know you are capable of sealing a contract. This shall be your first step. He turned around as he finished speaking, and his eyes bored viciously into her own. But while this project might be yours for now, make a decision regarding another project without my input again, and you might find yourself working in that cubicle for the rest of your life. Do I make myself clear, daughter? Yes, father, Weiss said, though her main intention was to simply placate the man for now. Good, he said, and sat back down. Since the staff tell me you have resumed your piano playing, you will also be performing at the gala. What? Weiss coughed, that sudden news having taken her completely aback. But I haven't been playing again for very long. With work and college next week, I don't think I... This is not a discussion, Weiss. Jacques cut her off absent-mindedly, his attention already returned to some paperwork on his desk. If you are rusty, then you will practice. Now I have work to do, so you can leave. Knowing better than to argue with him, Weiss gave a small nod and stood up to leave the office. She should have known it would happen, that her father would turn her renewed passion against her, but that didn't stop it from annoying her. Every single time she took an interest in something, he twisted it and turned it towards his own gain. The piano, the company, her project. However, as she thought about the chip, she found it lightened her mood. The task her father had given her was difficult, especially with the general having already denied their request for funding, but that only meant she would have to ensure that she succeeded. Not only was she not going to allow her project to be taken away from her, she was also going to use it as a chance to further her own goal, proving she was valuable to the company. As she shut the door behind her, she let out a sigh and quickly left the hallway. There was a lot to do in the coming weeks, but right now there were only 2 important things to her. The first would require only a single message, so she pulled out her scroll and quickly typed it out. I will be staying on Sunday, if that is okay with you. We'll have to leave early for college though. X. The second was likely one that would fight her a little, but she had a promise to uphold. So turning to head up the stairs, she made her way towards her brother's room to make sure he was okay. Yang Xiaolong. I will be staying on Sunday, if that is okay with you. We'll have to leave early for college though. X. A wide smile stretched itself over Yang's face as she read the message. She knew it must have been a sudden decision from the brevity of the statement, and though she wanted to ask what caused it, she knew Weiss was likely rather busy. So putting it aside, as a question for later, she quickly typed out her obvious response. You could stay every day of the week, and it would be more teach and okay. XXX. Hitting send and feeling her mood lighten considerably, Young placed her scroll back on the ground and picked back up her torque wrench to continue her work on her bike. As she worked on tightening the brake caliper bolts a little, she heard the voices of her friends that were walking into the garage. With a glance around from her position on the floor, She saw the long, toned legs of Pyrrha Nikos stood next to the shorter, freckled legs of Ilya Amatola. Now that is a sight! Yang grinned, her eyes trailing up to greet the pair of them. Do you ever stop flirting? Pyrrha asked in amusement, and nudged her in the back with her foot, Yang quickly spinning around in an attempt to smack her back but missing. Please, she has been flirting with everyone since she finally got those braces off. Ilya scoffed and sat down on the seat of the bike. What's got you so happy anyway? You were swearing at your wrench for being trash when I left. Now that sounds more like you. Pyrrha laughed and took a seat on a nearby table. Oh, this thing is still a broken piece of shit. Yang shrugged, though thankfully it had worked enough to properly tighten the bolts, so she quickly tossed it aside, the sound of metal on concrete ringing around the garage. Just heard from Weiss. Ugh! Ilya! What? Ilya replied indignantly and crossed her arms. I just don't get how you two could be friends. A sigh escaped Yang as she stood up, and not just because her legs screamed at her from being in one position for too long. Whenever Weiss was brought up around Ilya, the little chameleon girl would always turn slightly blonde and her mood would sour a little. Normally that would be enough to make Yang avoid the subject, as she did with the white fan or the girl's parents. But the issue was that Weiss was going to be around a lot more rather soon, so she needed Ilya to get used to that idea. She's nothing like her father, Yang said for what felt like the 1,000th time. Blake told you what she did for Sunday. Because you are friends, Ilya countered disbelievingly. What about all the others who aren't her friends? Do you know how many people I see in the groups who used to work at the STC and were fired for no reason after being treated so poorly? I highly doubt Weiss has much say in that, Pyrrha reasoned, picking up the tool Yang had cast aside and placing it in the box. She may be their heiress, but her father still runs things. Exactly, Yang confirmed while stretching her back, her arms reaching out to the ceiling. Plus, Weiss hates her father and is working to fix the company. Whatever you say, Ilya shrugged, though it was clear she still didn't believe her. So what time is Ruby back? Yang tapped the scroll with her toe to check the time. Like 45 minutes. Hey P, can you pass me that screwdriver? Didn't you spend all of yesterday with Ruby? Pyrrha asked curiously as she passed the screwdriver to Yang. And the day before? Not all day, Ilya said in a way that caught Yang's attention. Yang gave a slight glance at her friend and saw the freckles and hair had gone from blonde to a red that bordered on pink. Rolling her eyes at the irony of a chameleon faunus being as obvious as possible, Yang tightened one of the screws that kept the brake levers in place. So just half the day, Pyrrha said teasingly, clearly noticing what Yang had. It's not like that. I'm sure. She's just a friend who you've spent almost every day with since you got back and seem very eager to see again, Pyrrha said with a chuckle, the question hanging in the air as Ilya's hair grew slightly more pink. What do you think, Yang? Yang didn't answer straight away and focused on fixing her bike instead. If she was honest, Ilya crushing on Ruby didn't bother her much at all, as the two had always been rather close and had a lot in common. Should they start something, Yang really wouldn't feel any need to intervene. However, that didn't mean she didn't have reservations about it. One very specific reservation, in fact. Ilya wasn't over Blake, and everyone who knew the girl knew that. If you want to ask my sister out because you like her, then I don't have an issue, Yang said firmly, though she quickly straightened up and pointing the screwdriver at her friend. But if you're only doing it to get over Blake, then leave it alone. Ilya let out a loud sigh and slumped a little in her seat. I don't know what I want. I spent so long trying to get Blake to notice me that I never really looked at anyone else. Menagerie gave me a chance to work things out away from her. Been there. Both Yang and Pyrrha hummed, Yang passing the screwdriver back to Pyrrha. But you're actually dating the person you like, Ilya groaned at Pyrrha, Yang giving her maintenance a break to sit beside the girl. And you moved on. I'm guessing Menagerie didn't help as much as you hoped? Pyrrha asked carefully. Ilya looked down at her shoes and brought one leg up to play with her laces. A downcast look came over her face, and her freckles darkened to blue splotches. Giving the girl a minute as she recognized the reason, she gave Pyrrha a small glance and saw that recognition was held within her green eyes too. I think it did, Ilya breathed sadly. I think I've finally accepted it's not going to happen. A good first step, Yang said kindly with a nod. Yeah, but those feelings are still there. So what about Ruby? Pyrrha asked gently. I don't know what that is, Ilya shrugged. I remember she was always really cool and fun to hang out with, but I never saw her as anything more. But we stayed in contact while I was in Menagerie, and when I saw her the other day, she was a lot prettier than I remembered for some reason, and all the other stuff was still the same. I thought maybe there might be something there. Now I'm not sure. I really have no idea what I'm doing anymore. Letting out a disgruntled groan, Yang put an arm around her friend and pulled her close. She knew exactly how Ilya was feeling because she had felt the same when moving on with Arslan. The confusion of if the feelings were real, the feeling like you were betraying the person you liked. Accepting that it would never happen was the easy part, but moving on completely was a real struggle. She remembered that even after her relationship with Arslan ended, the odd glance from Blake would still send her heart racing, and had Weiss not stolen her heart so completely, they likely still would. Looking to Pyrrha, an unspoken understanding passed between them, and she received a small smile as the athlete got to her feet and left the room. With Ilya still focused on her laces, Yang let out a breath and gave her a small, comforting squeeze. It's good you're finally moving on, Yang said, making sure to keep her voice as soft as possible. But take it from me, they're likely not going to go away completely, but you still need to sort out these feelings before you do anything. If you think you want something with Ruby after you have a better handle on things, then you have my blessing. Though I should be honest and say I have no idea if she likes girls or not. Knowing my luck, she doesn't, the sullen girl said dully. If she doesn't, then you'll find someone else, Yang replied as Pyrrha reappeared in the garage doorway and held up a large tub of ice cream. But right now, we are gonna start working out your Blake stuff. We'll start with ice cream, then I'm thinking pizza and a movie. I don't know. Nope, there wasn't a choice there, Rainbow. Yang grinned and stood up, pulling the brooding girl with her. The loud groan that issued from the girl was a great indicator of just how little the girl wanted to face those feelings. But that was exactly why Yang knew she had to. Wallowing in the emotions would never get her anywhere, and Ilya really needed to talk it out with people who understood. So urging the girl forward into the living room, Yang quickly darted back into the garage to grab her scroll before shutting the door and grabbing the small stack of takeout menus from near it. If they were really going to help Ilya, it might require a little more than just pizza and ice cream. Chapter 45, Field Trip. Ruby rose. The sound of spraying water and excited chatter filled the air as Ruby looked around the area in wonder. She had seen the Vale branch of the STC on television numerous times, but seeing it in person was another thing altogether. The large, white stone building was one of the tallest in Vale, and its gleaming windows were visible from pretty much everywhere. Ruby knew that its architecture was common in Atlas, but with Vale's darker tones, the building stood out magnificently. The Schnee Tower did not stand alone though. In fact, the building had an entire square to itself. The square itself was filled with various things. Large lawns of well-maintained, green grass sprawled out with a winding path of white marble between them. Tables and benches were placed thoughtfully beneath lush, green trees in perfect spots where people could eat. In the center of everything was the source of the spraying sounds. A large fountain stood and filled the area with a soft trickling noise, and atop it was a statue depicting a burly man wearing a button-up suit with a see-through cube held in both hands. 3 rotating items were contained within. As Ruby got closer, she could see that they were a medical cross, a scroll, and a glowing blue orb that Ruby knew was meant to be a power cell. The man's kind face looked out over the square, with a jovial smile visible just beneath his beard. Though she would have loved to look at the fountain for longer and maybe check out the smaller buildings along the edges, Ruby had to keep moving with her class. As they moved towards the main building which stood at the back of the square, she heard her teacher rattling off random facts about the company's founding, facts that Ruby already knew. How could she not know them when she wanted to work there in the future? The world leaders in technological innovations that were in every house across Remnant, how could she not dream of working there one day, though admittedly, it was a dream she had kept to herself. She hadn't even told Yang about it, as she didn't know if it was a dream she could make come true for quite a while. She didn't want her sister asking Weiss for any favors either. She wanted to accomplish her dream on her own merits, not because her sister was dating the future CEO of the company. Walking through the doors, albeit the action taking 2 tries as the first failed due to her being so in her head that she bumped into a fellow student, Ruby stared up at the high ceiling, the entire thing one big screen that showed the clouds that filled the sky outside. She knew from books that it was a live feed from a camera on the roof, but she still found herself gawking, and completely missed the woman who had greeted them until she walked into her. Annoyingly, it was an unfortunate commonality in her life, so it happening twice in less than 5 minutes didn't surprise her one bit. Sorry, she stammered, looking up at the tall faunus woman to see her smiling. It's quite all right, the woman said kindly as Ruby backed away with a nervous smile. Straightening her dark green dress, she straightened up and passed a bag to the teacher as she looked over the class, who were already snickering at Ruby's clumsiness. Welcome to the STC, everyone. It's great to see so many students still interested in technology. My name is Abigail Jotties. Whichever name you wish to use is perfectly fine by me, and I will be showing you around our facilities today. Something entered her vision, and she looked around to see her teacher handing her a name tag with her name on it. Please make sure to keep your badges on at all time. They will track your position in the building, and will also allow you to get your lunch during our break. Now, if you all have your badges, please follow me. While Ruby was expecting to head to the elevators, she quickly realized how dumb that was with nearly 15 students in tow, so she course-corrected and made her way after her class towards the stairs. Ah! Ruby groaned and collapsed against the table. There had been so much walking and talking throughout the day that she was glad to finally have a breather. The tour of the building had been pretty extensive so far, but they had yet to arrive at the part she was really eager for. So far they had explored the science labs and the product development floor, but while she really did like those things, especially the product development tour as she got to see all the cool things getting built for testing, she was really looking forward to what would be the last tour of the day. The research and development department was where they came up with all the cool stuff. New scroll designs, experimental batteries, and other power sources. Pretty much everything the STC ever made had come from that department. And that was what Ruby wanted. To be a mind behind those projects, to be the first person who built some random piece of tech that could change the world. She loved what she did at home, repairing broken laptops and VCRs and other stuff, because it made her extremely happy. To be able to ensure that she would never lose another tape of her mother had started her passion, but she wanted to be able to give that to as many people as she could. Though admittedly, she had no idea what that would involve. She couldn't exactly fix everyone's VCR when they are already long since out of fashion. She had ideas, of course, but they were still a long way from meaning anything. She had worked on them a little for the last week, but had quickly realized that they would never be ready. Salutations. Huh? Raising her head from the table, she looked up to see a small, freckled girl standing before her holding a tray. She wore a pair of gray overalls with green accents over a white blouse, and a pair of black stockings covered her legs. Her bright orange hair fell to just above her shoulder, curling at the tips, and a light pink bow poked out from the back of her head. The oddest thing, however, was that her bright green eyes sparkled as a wide smile etched onto her face. Would I be able to sit here with you? The girl said, her voice rather proper, but in an oddly robotic way. The other tables are quite full. Oh, Ruby said, and looked to see that her table was the only one with some space. It wasn't particularly surprising, as the only person who ever really sat with her was Oscar. Sure. Thank you, Ruby Rose. My name is Penny. The girl held out a hand that was stark white, even compared to her already exceptionally pale complexion, but as Ruby tentatively reached out to take it, the limb fell at the wrist and dangled there comically. With her own hand having stopped in midair, Ruby looked up at the girl to see her brow had furrowed a little. Oh, right, she said, and placed her tray down on the table, so that she could reach out with a hand that actually did match her skin tone. My apologies. My father is rather busy right now, so I have to wait to get that fixed. You have a prosthetic arm? Ruby asked stupidly as she reached out to shake it for a second. Her excitement of having just seen one up close for the first time started to edge out her awkwardness. Yes, Penny replied with a smile as she sat down. And a leg, though thankfully that does not need fixing, this time. Ruby felt a small smile pull at her lips due to the ease of which the girl seemed to talk about her condition, as her own had always been something she tried her best to pretend didn't exist. However, she still found herself a little jealous of her classmates. They all seemed to have such an easy time making friends, of laughing and talking about pretty much anything and everything, but it had never been that way for her. She was fine with specific conversations, or with having fun with people she was very close to, but those relationships always took time. Though she was in her last year at school, Oscar was the only real friend she had managed to make on her own. Of course she had plenty of others, but those were Yang's friends, who she had grown close to because they were always around. But when she went off to college, she wouldn't even have Oscar anymore. It worried her a lot in all honesty because she was just so awkward around new people. She had tried a number of times to practice small talk in the mirror, to try and make herself normal like she thought everyone around her was. But every time she tried to put that into practice, she fell short, and it just led to people snickering at her. The worst had been in middle school, where students had taken to calling her Rambling Ruby. They taunted her, mocked her shyness, even chased her when she was feeling particularly down. And though Yang had quickly seen to that, and put a stop to it when she found out, Ruby still hated being chased. It did something to her, made her panic in a way she hated. She'd talked about all of those things with her therapist, but those feelings had never gone away. After a couple of years, however, she had simply given up and resigned herself to her awkwardness. It wasn't all bad though. She enjoyed hanging out with Oscar, even though she often felt bad as she knew he wanted a little more, but he seemed to understand that she wasn't interested in him that way. Then of course there was Ilya, someone who she had found herself really enjoying the company of lately. They had been in regular contact while the older Faunus was in menagerie, and they had spent pretty much every day together since her return. Things felt easy with Ilya. She seemed to understand what it was like being an outcast and never pushed for Ruby to be anything but herself. Other than those two, she was actually rather happy when being left to her own devices. "Forgive me for asking," Penny said kindly, though her tone made it sound like the apology was merely something she thought she should say. "But why are you sitting alone and not with your friends? Are you having a fight?" "They're not my friends," Ruby sighed, plucking at her sandwich meekly, as she wasn't too fond of mayonnaise. "Then we are the same," Penny said happily, taking a small bit of what looked to be an egg and cress sandwich. "I have no friends either." Much like her earlier statement, the words were said in an almost robotic way. Something about the girl felt off, yet oddly familiar at the same time. She was very clearly awkward due to her openness, and it was even clearer why she didn't have friends, but it was the same reason Ruby didn't have many friends. Penny didn't fit in. And likely for that reason alone, Ruby found a lot of the nerves that were usually associated with a new acquaintance faded away. "I'm sorry to hear that," Ruby said with a soft voice, only for Penny to shake her head in return. "It's quite all right," Penny shrugged with a smile. "Though it does sometimes get a little lonely." "I can relate there," Ruby replied with an understanding nod. "So, how did you break your arm?" "It fell down the stairs." "Your arm?" "Yes," Penny said with a firm nod of her head, though she didn't sound upset about it at all. "I forget to secure it, and it slipped off." "Oh." For some reason, Ruby got the feeling that much like she had a tendency to walk into people, Penny's limbs falling off was an everyday occurrence. "Would your father be mad that you broke it?" "Oh no, not at all," Penny said firmly, and pulled her half-eaten sandwich apart to eat only one slice of the bread. "My father is a very kind man. He will likely be thankful that it wasn't my leg that I forgot to secure again." "That's good then," Ruby smiled, putting her own sandwich aside and eating her cookie instead. "Did your father make it for you? I assume he works here?" "He did. He made all my arms and legs while I was growing up." It was such an odd thing to hear, but even odder to hear it said so happily. In fact, Ruby doubted she would ever hear someone say such a thing in such a happy voice again. The fact that the girl before her seemed so comfortable with who she was brought a smile to Ruby's face. "He sounds like a really good dad." "He is," Penny said happily. "So what are you doing at the STC?" For the 5 minutes, Ruby found herself in comfortable conversation with the quirky ginger. After telling her what she was doing at the STC, Penny had revealed that she was the daughter of one of the scientists in the Research and Development Department. She had also talked about studying computer sciences at Beacon. What had been the most exciting, however, was when Ruby had talked about her interest in mechanics, Penny had actually detached her arm to let her inspect it. It was a dream come true for Ruby, but she had been rather cautious at first as she didn't want to break it any more than it already was. But Penny had reassured her that her father wouldn't mind and would be able to fix it anyway. After the assurance that it was fine, Ruby had gladly accepted and spent the next 5 minutes looking at the incredibly complex inner workings of the prosthetic. Of course, she had no idea what most of it did, but she never thought she would get to see one so close for a while. She had even managed to maybe see what was wrong with it, and pointed out to Penny what looked to be a broken hinge that was no longer supporting the weight of the hand. However, as she was handing the limb back to Penny, she heard a voice from near the entrance of the cafeteria. "Ruby!" Looking to her side at her teacher's voice, Ruby saw her classmates gathered around their teacher and knew she had to go. She found a small part of her was disappointed at that realization, so turned back to Penny with a regretful look. "I'm sorry, I've got to go explore the scroll communications department." She groaned and stood up with her tray. "It was nice talking to you though, and good luck with your arm." "That place is sensational," Penny said with a wide smile, and went to raise her prosthetic arm, before remembering it was busted and waving with her other one instead. "Farewell, Ruby Rose. I hope to meet you again someday." "You too, Penny." Giving the girl a wide smile of her own, Ruby returned the wave and walked away. She was a little sad that her conversation with Penny had ended so soon, but couldn't help but be a little proud of herself for actually managing to talk with someone like they were just two normal people for once. The tour of the scroll communications floor had actually been much more interesting than Ruby had originally though. Listening to the technician talk about the upkeep of the equipment had obviously been the highlight, but listening to the operators talk about how they manage all the calls through the surprisingly thorough programming wasn't as dull as she expected. Thankfully, however, the tour had only lasted an hour before they moved on. It was with a smile that Ruby happily followed her teacher and Mrs. Jotties down a long hallway. The walls were a stark white, and if she was honest, she was quite thankful for the lights above. During the tour, she had noticed the company seemed to favor the bright bulbs, and due to the white walls they had begun to give her a little bit of a headache. But thankfully the hallway to the R&D department had chosen some softer lights that gave the hallway a pleasant, yellowish glow. Seeing Mrs. Jotties stop in front of a pair of large doors, the whole class came to a halt and Ruby finally succeeded in stopping on time. Watching as the woman turned to face them, she focused intently on every word the woman said. "Now we are at the department that no doubt most of you have been wanting to see all day," the woman said with a knowing smile. "Behind these doors is most of the projects the STC are currently working on, albeit a few secret ones that you will have to wait a few years to see. Due to these still being rather fragile, expensive, and some even having live power running through them, I please ask that you don't touch anything while you are here. Everyone understand that?" the teacher asked, earning a loud groan of agreement from the class, and Ruby understood their frustration at their teacher's tendency to treat them like they were still toddlers. "Good. Whenever you are ready then, Mrs. Jotties." With a nod to the teacher, their guide pushed open the doors, and with palpable anticipation, the class walked through them. Ruby had expected to be impressed, but the sight that greeted her was more than what she could have imagined. The room was huge, explaining why the corridor before was so narrow, and filled with things that Ruby would likely never know the use of. Along the far wall was an entire see-through cabinet with dozens of shelves, each one holding a half-complete project behind a glass door that was marked with a number. The other walls lining the room held doors, the windows beside them showing offices and storerooms. Around the room were 5 large, circular tables, 4 of which were made of wood and sat in corners of the room, each surrounded by people talking and comparing notes on whiteboards. The 5th, however, was made of glass and metal, and sat right in the center of the room. The table itself was split into 4 sections, with each section cordoned off from the other with a glass screen, and each section held a project that was currently being worked on. From the briefest glance, one held what looked to be a prototype for a new prosthetic that was being worked on by a man in a blue waistcoat. As they approached, his head raised to look in the mirror before turning around to look at them with a raised eyebrow. "Dr. Watts," the woman said with a pleasant smile as the man stood up and stroked his walrus mustache. "I was just showing the signal students around. Students, this is—" "Say the introductions, Jotties," the man interrupted with an almost bored look. "If you must bother someone with this, I'm sure Dr. Polidina has more than enough time on his hands. I, however, have work to do." "Oh, of course," the woman said, her smile staying on her face, but no longer as bright as it was before. "Come on, students, I will show you a few of our exciting projects that should be releasing within the year." With a murmur of excitement, the students followed the woman to a nearby table where a group of people were hovered over a smaller project. As she walked past the man Jotties had called Watts, she met his eye and felt herself immediately look away at his glare. Lowering her head, she quickly caught up with the rest of her group. For the next 40 minutes, Ruby took in all the information she could about what she was shown. The first thing they got to look at was something simple, the new scroll that was set to release in the summer, and they even got to handle it. It wasn't anything special, and mainly just an upgrade to the last one, but the technology was still cool to look at. Once they had done with that, they moved on to a cutting-edge power source that, when finished, would be used as backup for hospitals and emergency shelters. Despite them obviously not showing the important stuff that were still secret, Ruby was quite happy to look at everything she was shown. The thing that excited her most, however, was when they were shown the almost finished design for a projected television. It may not be a world-changing piece of technology, but it was pretty awesome to her. The base that projected the holographic screen was only a little bigger than the palm of her hand, making it extremely portable. There were also sliders that adjusted the size of the projection, so it was possible to use it as a standard television, or for travel by plugging it into a power outlet. With power outlets and car adapters being everywhere now, anyone who cared about technology was excited for the release. Unfortunately, she knew it was going to be priced way out of her range. After they had sadly moved on from the device, Jotties led them all to a door that stood apart from the others. With the curtains being closed, Ruby was unable to see inside, but the woman stopped outside the door and turned to face them all. "And here we have the office of Dr. Polendina." The woman gave a short knock on the door, and a cheerful voice called for her to enter. "Dr. Polendina, the steward." "Oh." Her voice faltered for a minute. "Sorry, I didn't know you were busy." "It's perfectly okay, Jotties. Bring them in," the man replied, his voice kind and warm. "I am almost done here anyway." With a nod, Jotties opened up the door to allow them to enter. As they filed into the room, Ruby found herself taken aback yet again, though not by the white-haired man that sat at his desk, but by the pale, orange-haired girl who was sat in a chair next to him. Penny watched as they all entered, and when Ruby entered, she girl gave a wide smile and waved. "Salutations, Ruby Rose, again." "Hi, Penny," Ruby replied with a shy wave of her own, her classmates turning to look at her, as the man, that she could conclude was Penny's father, glanced up at her with a smile. Now, Penny dear," he said kindly, and held up the arm that Ruby herself had been inspecting earlier. "Best not to interrupt the students. Here you go, all fixed. Best get going before you are late for your class." "Right you are, father," Penny said happily, slipping the arm on and twisting it into place before giving the man a hug. Once it was done, Penny quickly made her way towards the door, but stopped short and turned to Ruby with a wide grin. "You were right about what was damaged with my arm. You will be a great engineer someday, I just know it." Thanks," Ruby stammered as the girl left while humming a tune to herself. If the class were looking at her before, they were practically staring now, and Ruby let her eyes fall to the floor. She had never been one for attention. "I apologize for that," Dr. Polendina said with a smile as wide as his daughter's. "I can handle them for now, Jotties. I believe Mr. Thrush could use some help." "Of course, Doctor," the woman who had been guiding them replied. "I shall be back in 15 for them." Receiving a simple nod from him, Mrs. Jotties made her way out of the room. "I'm afraid that even in my office there are not enough seats in here for all of you, so why don't you all take what you can and I shall go and retrieve the last few we need. Miss Meadows, would it be okay to get some aid from young Miss Rose, was it?" "Of course," Ruby's teacher said, while organizing the students, who had already began to scuffle in their pursuit of a chair. "Ruby, please help Dr. Polendina." "As sure," Ruby said, knowing it wasn't a coincidence that the man had asked for her specifically. Following the man out of the room and towards one of the nearby circular tables for some spare chairs, Ruby held her arms crossed. She wasn't sure why he had asked for her, but she feared she might have done something wrong by looking at Penny's arm. "Sorry for pulling you away, Miss Rose," he said finally as they reached the table and stacked a few of the chairs. "I simply wish to thank you for keeping my Penny company today." "Oh," Ruby said, thankful that her fears were wrong. "It was no problem. She's really sweet." "That she is," the man chuckled, the sincerity of the sound making the room feel much warmer. "Though even I have admit that being raised by parents obsessed with robots, in a house with such films always playing, has clearly influenced her personality. Not many people are willing to sit down with her due to it." "Well, people can be dumb," Ruby said, feeling herself blush at having been so brazen, though the man simply let out another laugh. That is certainly true. He grinned and picked up the chairs. Good work on the observation of her arm too. Engineers these days have a tendency to always look for the most complex thing and miss the obvious. It's refreshing to meet someone who still knows the importance of checking the fundamentals. Thank you. She stuttered as she picked up the other stack of chairs, shocked that she had just been complimented for her skill by one of the world's most renowned engineers. No more words were exchanged as they made their way back into the office and spread the chairs out, but Ruby already felt much better. Picking a chair at the back of the room, Ruby settled in to listen to whatever Dr. Polendina was about to say. As she listened to the man talk about what he did at the company and the projects he was working on, she realized just how far she still had to go. While she understood a lot of what the man said, he would frequently mention things and methods that she and her classmates had never heard of. It was no doubt purposeful, as if he were to talk with the full extent of his full knowledge, then none of them would understand a word for at least a few years. Nonetheless, Ruby took all the notes she could. When questions had come around, Ruby couldn't help feel like her way stupid, but once most of the class had asked theirs, Dr. Polendina had looked to her. After what felt like an eternity, she had asked him what minor, personal project he was most proud of was. A wide smile had broken over his face at the question, and he had quickly launched into a little story about how he had messed around with a large toy car so that Penny could drive around and keep up with them as a child while he worked on her limbs. The story itself was heartwarming to hear, and the entire class had laughed at his expression of irony that his daughter had been driving since she was 5, yet still couldn't get her license. Once the 15 minutes were up, Mrs. Jotties returned, and they all thanked him for the talk before leaving and making their way over to the center table. As part of their tour, the STC was actually giving them an early update to the Scroll's next operating software that was to release the next week. It was while waiting for her turn that she saw her walk into the room. At first, she didn't recognize her, but on a second look, she saw that it was actually Weiss. She looked so different than she always did when visiting the house, but it wasn't anything physical. She was wearing her hair the same way as always, and Ruby had definitely seen her wear those white pants and blue shirt before, but something about her was much more rigid and frightening, though not in a scary way, but more an awe-inspiring way. Whenever she visited the house, she was always relaxed. A smile always painted her features, and she seemed very easygoing, but in her place of work, she looked like someone that shouldn't be messed with. Was her relaxed state really just because of her relationship with Yang? Ruby thought to herself curiously, confused as to what could make someone go from pure businesswoman to a smiling lover so effortlessly. While friendships were rough for Ruby, they were nothing compared to the idea of relationships. The idea of finding someone had always confused her, as people often only said that you would know when you find that person, that you would feel it. Even Yang had told her as much when she'd asked. But Ruby had never felt it, or at least she didn't think she had. It wasn't that she didn't want something like that one day, because, if how much she enjoyed Blake's romance stories meant anything, then she did. She had just never found anyone she felt that way for. Like her inability to communicate easily, it bothered her sometimes. Especially when she remembered how easy Yang seemed to find herself in relationships. Guys, girls, they all seemed easy for Yang. But just like her other issues, it was something she also tried to ignore. Realizing she was in her head about it again, Ruby closed her eyes and shook the thoughts away. Upon opening them, she saw Weiss was looking at her, and the woman gave a subtle wave as she walked towards the office they had just exited. Unfortunately, Ruby instinctively reacted. "Hey, Weiss!" She caught herself, but she knew it was too late. She had already taken a step forward as she called out, and she was very aware that her classmates were watching her. Weiss raised an eyebrow, her hand already resting on the handle of the door, and Ruby turned away to simply look at the floor, very aware of the snickers that were issuing from her classmates. "Recognized by one guy's kid, and she thinks she knows Weiss Schnee," one of her classmates scoffed to her friend, who chuckled. Not correcting them, as she knew she had already messed up, Ruby let out a sigh and turned back to wait for her turn. She hated that she sometimes just blurted out things even when she knew she shouldn't. It had happened with Oscar about her sister's relationship with Weiss, and though Yang hadn't been angry, she had scolded her for. "Hello, Ruby." The sound of Weiss' voice right behind her, and the tap on her shoulder drew her out of her head. Turning back around, she saw Weiss standing there with a smile on her face. The sight confused her. She had messed up and called out to Weiss when she wasn't supposed to even know her, so why was Weiss talking to her instead of continuing her business? I forgot that your visit was today. How are you enjoying the STC so far? Huh? Ruby thought to herself. Weiss shouldn't have known that she was visiting. Fine. Ruby stuttered a little, still rather confused as to why Weiss was taking this risk. Good, I hope my staff are treating you well. Weiss smiled again. How is Yang? Again Ruby was filled with confusion. The couple had spent the entire morning talking before Ruby had to leave, so Weiss clearly knew how Yang was. However, as if sensing her hesitancy, Ruby saw Weiss' eyes flick to her left where the girl, who had made the earlier comment, was stood. The blue orbs filled with a cold ice that even made Ruby shiver, and the realization hit. Weiss had heard the girl's jab and was not happy about it. Feeling a confidence well within her that Weiss cared so much for her as to risk her secret over a comment that wasn't too out of the norm, Ruby finally raised her head properly. She's fine, Ruby said carefully, as Weiss' eyes returned to hers and became much softer. She's spending the day at the gym. No doubt working out her nerves for tomorrow, Weiss said thoughtfully. Obviously Yang had told Weiss about the upcoming meeting with Raven too. Duh, why wouldn't she? Yeah, Ruby said, feeling a little braver. Typical Yang. Can't argue there. Weiss grinned softly, checking her watch. I'm really sorry, Rubes. I really would stay and maybe give you and your class a more thorough tour, but I do have a meeting that I must attend. Please give Yang my best and tell her that I am looking forward to our meeting on Sunday. Weiss paused for a minute, clearly noticing her own little error, and continued. That last art piece she did for me was fantastic, and I can't wait to see what she has for me next. I'll let her know, Ruby said confidently, knowing the last part had simply been a cover, as she already knew Weiss was staying over on Sunday. I hope your meeting goes well. Thank you, Weiss said with an appreciative nod, and made her way back to Dr. Polendina's office. Once Weiss had walked in and shut the door, Ruby turned back to her class with a smile on her face and saw them all staring at her in shock. Even her teacher was staring. Feeling a little blush from the unfamiliar attention, Ruby looked back down at her notes as the engineer went through them one by one and updated their scrolls. 20 minutes later, Ruby climbed up onto the bus and took her seat. The day had been much weirder than she expected. When she had set out that morning, she had thought she would just see a bunch of new tech, talk to some workers, get some information, then head home. What she hadn't expected was to meet someone new, get complimented by a world-renowned inventor, and then have her entire class find out that she was friends with Weiss. Her classmates hadn't said a single word to her since Weiss had talked to her, not even when she dropped her scroll trying to give it to the engineer. Honestly, she quite liked that the situation hadn't caused them to snicker. For once, she didn't feel like the gazes on her were mocking her for not fitting in. So with a small smile to herself as everyone took their seats on the bus, Ruby looked at her scroll and saw she already had a message. Unsurprisingly, it was from Ilya, and she quickly opened it. How was the trip? Got some free time after work if you want to geek out about it? Feeling oddly happy at the offer, Ruby hurriedly typed out a yes and settled in for the drive home. The day had definitely not been what she expected, but she ultimately decided that was definitely a good thing.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.